And now I have the honor of presenting the final award for the day. We are honoring the Disability Policy Consortium and Colin Killick for their leadership on fair housing and advocacy for the expansion of the state's alternative housing voucher program, giving people with disabilities the tools they need to obtain safe, affordable, and accessible homes, and really for ongoing efforts to make housing access more equitable. The Disability Policy Consortium's analysis shows that people with disabilities are more than twice as likely to experience homelessness and housing insecurity than non-disabled people. Even with a housing voucher, people with disabilities face another significant barrier of accessibility and then often makes finding suitable housing really incredibly challenging. As key advocates for the state's alternative housing voucher program, the Disability Policy Consortium has expanded the opportunities for people with disabilities to find homes that are affordable and accessible and will allow them the opportunities that we all want to thrive. I am continuously impressed by the team at the Disability Policy Consortium for their commitment and their tireless advocacy that has resulted in the tremendous growth of the state program. So I turn it over to you, my friend, Colin Killick.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you to everyone at CHAPA. You folks are incredible partners in this work. And it's a delight to work with you on all these issues. I want to just briefly let you know about DPC and then basically tell you a story of how this work came about. So we are for those who don't know us, a statewide disability civil rights advocacy and research organization based in Malden. More than 85% of our staff, including me, including everyone on our senior management team, has a disability of one kind or another, ranging from learning disabilities and mental health diagnoses to deafness and paralysis and autism. And we work on disability issues, which is to say we work on most things, because people with disabilities are cut across every other social group. And it's funny, there's this notion of that we're so terribly distinct, right? That our issues are so very separate. I mean, in fact, people coined the phrase, which I honestly hate, of special needs. Well, our needs aren't terribly special, right? The things people with disabilities need in this state, in this country, are more access to employment, an end to the link between disability and poverty, right? We need high quality healthcare. We need places to live, right? And the reasons why we don't have those things don't have much to do with our inherent medical diagnoses. They have to do with discrimination, right? I was incredibly, moved by the work earlier, and I'm excited by the work earlier around, testing. That same testing has been done around housing discrimination against people with disabilities and found very similar results. Accessibility, as I'll get to later on this, is another major issue, right? And in the housing market, it is very often accessible or affordable, pick one, right? And so if you are disabled and you are low income, and people with disabilities are vastly more likely, at least two, probably more like 3 times more likely to be in poverty than people without disabilities, then it's the rather cruel irony that there are accessible units being built all the time in this city in luxury apartment buildings that you cannot possibly afford to live in. But one of the biggest things here exactly is affordability. And so I'm basically going to tell you a story about an effort to try and address that affordability problem for members of our community. The story of a program, it's the story of our organization and of a few people, including me. So back in 1995, long before I got involved in this work, long before I knew what any of this was, AHVP, Alternative Housing Voucher Program, was created. And it was created as a compromise, really as compensation to our community. Because the year prior, the state imposed quotas on its elderly disabled housing portfolio of 13.5%, no more than 13.5% of residents of those buildings to this day can be people with disabilities under age 65. There were a lot of reasons for that. In my view, at least some of them were fear-mongering against people with disabilities, people with mental health diagnoses specifically. But at any rate, a lot of people lost the ability to live in those units that then they were some of a pretty small number of units that were always affordable and accessible. And so thanks to the efforts of disability advocates back then, this program was created. And when it was created, it had $4 million in funding, which was then enough to provide 800 vouchers a year. And then, as so many programs do, they're created in a surge of advocacy, and the issue fades, and the program sits in the budget, and year by year it declines. And so fast forward to 2013, the program had dipped to $3.45 million, which by the housing market of that year was only enough to provide about 350 vouchers. And the disability community was beginning to focus on housing, the lack of affordable, accessible housing, as a major issue affecting our community. The sadly no longer extant Multicultural Independent Living Center of Boston conducted a poll that year of mostly disabled people of color in Roxbury, Dorchester, and surrounding area, and found that they rated lack of affordable and accessible housing as the biggest public health issue affecting people with disabilities. Meanwhile, that year, I personally was 23 years old, between jobs, had just lost my godmother, and was about to get a mass email that changed my life. I have been disabled since I was born. I have a neurological disorder that impairs my fine motor skills, as well as executive function disorder and depression. I only got through high school, let alone eventually grad school, because of my accommodations, because I had, under my 504 plan, I had a civil right to accommodations in the classroom. And I've also been very political since I was quite young. I have pretty early memories of going to, anti-war protests, right, of, I was, involved in the local Democratic Party, et cetera. I went to college to study political economy. I knew I wanted to do something regarding advocacy, but I never connected the two because I didn't know that there was a disability rights movement. But I finished college. I came to Somerville to work as a Vista. I joined my local disability commission to get involved in the community. And I started meeting advocates, the folks who had taken over federal buildings in San Francisco, as documented in Crip Camp, if any of you have seen it, to get that 504 plan that gave me my rights enacted into law. People who had dragged themselves up the steps of the Capitol in DC to get the ADA passed in 1990. And then I got that email. It was for folks to come to the Capitol to testify against an attempt to raise fares on the ride, the paratransit service for low-income people with disabilities. And I went and I met someone who's now one of my best friends, Allegra Heath Stout, who was then a community organizer at Boston Center for Independent Living, and said, we're getting together a group of disabled volunteers to work on this housing issue, trying to grow this neglected housing voucher program for people with disabilities. Do you want to join? And I said, sure. And I joined and didn't have a job at the moment. And I kind of threw myself into this project as a volunteer. And we set a goal that year. We figured, well, what's our goal? Well, we want to get the program back to 800 vouchers. We figured that'll take about $8 million. And we didn't know enough to know then that, you don't say, that a program that's currently at $3.45 million, that your goal is to get it to $8 million. But we tried and we learned a lot. We went to the State House, we put together this little team, and we got an increase that year of $100,000, but it was the first increase that program had gotten in over a decade. And then as a result of this, I discovered this is what I wanted to do with my life. So I got into a training program for young Jewish community organizers. And I got placed at the Disability Policy Consortium as an organizer. And we started this project, the Housing Advocacy Leadership Team, with Boston Center for Independent Living. And we recruited this group of people, all of them disabled, all of them currently or formerly homeless or housing insecure, all of whom had incredible stories. Folks like Donna, who was presently living at Father Bill's with her adult daughter, struggling to find housing. Charlie, who was a former veteran, former policy wonk type himself, actually, who, thanks to depression, had lost his job, his marriage, his house, and had been on and off the streets for decades. And we just started going to the State House over and over and over again, and talking to legislators and telling these stories, explaining that people with disabilities were massively homeless, that it was cheaper to give people the dignity of housing to have them in there and have them be independent in the community instead of either leaving them on the streets or having them wind up in a nursing home. And that year we got $1 million increase. And we started having conversations with folks, including Rachel and Eric at CHAPA, about what the future of this program might be. I went on to grad school, but the program kept going under my successor, Lenny Somerville, who's now our director of advocacy, and it hit $5 million and then $6 million. And it was handed off again to a new organizer, R. Feynman, and under their leadership, it hit $8 million. And not only were new vouchers issued, and new housing authorities joined the program, but we actually raised payment standards to make the program more usable. And we got to the point where we were nearly at the point finally of getting this program back to the number of vouchers it offered in 1995, when the state's population was much smaller, when the need for affordable housing was much less. And so we kept going. And last year, the program was budgeted at $12.5 million. This year's House budget has $14.2 million. As we speak, there's a pilot program being rolled out in which 50 AHVP vouchers are going to be used specifically to transition people with disabilities from nursing homes back into the community, not only giving them dignity, but help keeping them safe from COVID. And we're going to keep pushing to grow the program. Years and years ago, I remember talking with Rachel and with Eric and another folks at CHAPA about the notion that someday there could be project-based AHVP vouchers. And at the time, it was a pipe dream, and now it is beginning to look like a realistic possibility, such that we can make sure that some of these new accessible units that are being built can remain permanently affordable. So that's our hope. And we're very proud of what's gotten done here. And I do think it shows that what disabled people can do as organizers, as advocates, but it doesn't mean we're anywhere close to solving the problem, because the goal has to be breaking the link between disability and homelessness. That statistic Rachel mentioned at the top, that members of our community are more than twice as likely to be homeless as those without disabilities. So this funding we're going for, I guess it will cover something in the neighborhood of 1,200 vouchers, maybe a bit more, depending on the payment standard. There are tens of thousands of people with disabilities in need of housing in this state. So we need to keep fighting. We need to address the fact that nearly 300,000 people with disabilities in this country died because of COVID-19. And that was in no small part due to them being stuck in nursing homes due to lack of housing. And so I will ask you, support AHVP, support H2420, which is an act relative to expanding the availability of adaptable housing for consumers with disabilities, because all the vouchers in the world will make no difference if there are no affordable units, accessible units for people with disabilities to move into. Again, H2420, please endorse that bill. And think about accessibility in your projects, in your communities. Think about whether people with disabilities are at the table. When you're writing zoning laws, think about whether they include our community. When you think about your campaigns, think about whether they include people with disabilities. And if they don't, think about why and whether they're accessible. And I will leave it there in the interest of time. But thank you again so much to CHAPA for all this, your support, and for this honor.